It started like any other invite from Ryan. "Jake, we need this cruise. 7 days, Caribbean, drinks, beaches, you in?" His pitch was solid. I needed a break from my monotonous desk job and a boss who thought work-life balance was a myth. Reluctantly, I said yes, and a week later, I was staring up at the Ocean Dream, docked in Miami. It looked like a floating city, massive, gleaming, and promising an escape from reality. The first few hours on board were surreal. Passengers buzzed with excitement as we explored. My cabin had a private balcony, perfect for morning coffee with ocean views. Ryan was already in full vacation mode, dragging me to the pool deck to start the trip right. That evening, I stepped onto my balcony, letting the cool breeze and faint sound of waves settle my thoughts. For a moment, everything felt perfect, until I noticed a faint light on the horizon. It was distant, almost unnoticeable, but something about it unsettled me. I brushed it off as a fishing boat and went to bed. The next day, we docked in Key West. Ryan and I explored the island, sipping frozen drinks and laughing at tacky souvenirs. The atmosphere was carefree, but I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. Back on the ship, I decided to roam the upper decks alone. The view of the horizon was stunning, but then I saw it again. A small, dark boat, just sitting there. Unlike the bustling cruise, it felt eerily still. I flagged down a crew member and pointed it out. "That boat, it's been following us, hasn't it?" He looked uneasy. "Just a fishing boat, sir. Nothing to worry about." His tone wasn't convincing. Later that night, the captain made an announcement. "Due to unexpected weather, we advise all passengers to remain on board tonight." Unexpected weather? The sky was clear, the ocean calm. Ryan joked that they wanted us to spend more money at the ship's bars, but I wasn't convinced. As night fell, I returned to my balcony. The mysterious boat was closer now, its faint silhouette illuminated by the moon. Something wasn't right. By the third day, the mood on the ship shifted. Crew members whispered among themselves, their expressions tight. The passengers hadn't noticed, but I had. I overheard a group of people near the pool. I heard one of the crew say there's something following us, a man whispered. "You think it's pirates?" a woman asked nervously. The word pirates hit me like a punch. Could that boat really mean trouble? That evening I wandered close to the bridge. Through a small window, I saw crew members huddled around a radar screen. A blip moved steadily behind us. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the tension in the room was palpable. The captain's announcement came shortly after. "Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety, please remain in your cabins tonight." Ryan rolled his eyes, but I felt my stomach drop. Whatever was happening, it wasn't normal. It was 2 a.m. when I woke to the sound of alarms and shouting. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. Opening my cabin door, I saw passengers running in every direction. "Pirates!" someone screamed. "They're on board!" I ran to Ryan's cabin, banging on the door until he opened it, disheveled and groggy. "Jake, what the hell's going on?" "Pirates," I said breathlessly. "We need to move, now." As we made our way to the lower decks, I saw them. Masked figures, heavily armed, barking orders. One fired a warning shot into the air, silencing the chaos. "Everyone on the floor," a man shouted. Ryan and I ducked into a storage closet, our breaths shallow as we listened to the chaos outside. "They're looking for something," Ryan whispered. "This isn't just about money." From our hiding spot, we overheard snippets of conversation. The pirates weren't just robbing the ship. They were searching for something specific. "Where is it?" one demanded. "We know it's here." Ryan and I crept toward the bridge, sticking to the shadows. Near the captain's quarters, we overheard a heated argument. "You shouldn't have accepted the artifact," one crew member said. "I told you it would bring trouble." The captain's voice was tense. "We didn't have a choice. The museum paid us a fortune. How was I supposed to know it would attract them?" Artifact? Museum? What were they talking about? My pulse quickened as I realized this wasn't just a random attack. As we retreated, we stumbled upon a group of passengers hiding in a supply room. Among them was an older man named Frank, a retired Navy SEAL. "We can't just sit here and wait to die," he said. "We need to fight back." Frank laid out a plan to disable the explosives the pirates had planted around the ship. "If we can take out their leverage, we might have a chance," he said. Ryan and I volunteered to help. Armed with flashlights and tools, we followed Frank through the ship's dark corridors. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. In the engine room, we found the first set of explosives. Frank worked quickly, his hands steady. "If they blow this, the whole ship goes down," he muttered. While Frank disarmed the explosives, I noticed a crate tucked into the corner, partially hidden. Inside was a golden mask, its hollow eyes staring back at me. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. "That's what they're after," Frank said grimly. "And it's cursed." Before we could process what that meant, the lights flickered, and the air seemed to grow heavier. It felt like the artifact was watching us. We managed to disarm the explosives, but the tension was suffocating. The pirates weren't going to give up, and now we had their prize. Back on deck, the pirates were furious. Their leader held the captain at gunpoint. "Hand over the artifact or we sink this ship." Frank handed me the mask. "Go, distract them, we'll cover you." My hands trembled as I stepped into view. "Looking for this?" I shouted, holding up the mask. The pirates turned, their eyes locking onto the artifact. For a moment, they froze, mesmerized. Then, chaos erupted. Frank and Ryan ambushed the leader, while the passengers scattered. In the struggle, the mask slipped from my grasp, sliding toward the edge of the deck. The pirate leader lunged for it, but Frank tackled him, sending them both to the railing. "Let it go!" Frank shouted. The pirate hesitated, and with one last push, the mask tumbled into the ocean. The pirates, disoriented and leaderless, retreated, but the damage was done. A stray shot ignited a fuel line, and flames engulfed the side of the ship. Ryan and I helped guide passengers to the lifeboats as the fire spread. The Ocean Dream groaned, its structure failing. We barely made it onto the last lifeboat as the ship sank, its fiery remains swallowed by the sea. Back on shore, the survivors were shaken but alive. No one spoke of the artifact, and the authorities seemed eager to sweep the incident under the rug. Even now, I can't forget the mask. It felt alive, like it wasn't just lost at sea. It was waiting. I'd always dreamed of going on a cruise. The thought of being on a luxurious ship in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by nothing but the endless sea and sky, seemed magical. So when my best friend Ethan invited me to join him on the Ocean Monarch, departing from Miami, I didn't hesitate to say yes. The ship was enormous, like a floating city with pools, gourmet restaurants, theaters, and even a casino. The moment we stepped on board, I was hit with the scent of salt water and the sound of live music. It felt like we'd left the real world behind. A week of sun, fun, and relaxation lay ahead, with stops in the Bahamas and Key West. On the first night, there was a deck party. The sky was clear, the lights were sparkling, and the air was filled with laughter and music. It was perfect, until Ethan pointed something out. "Did you see the radar screen in the control room when we passed? There was a huge storm forming out there." I chuckled, brushing him off. "Dude, you've watched way too many disaster movies. This ship's massive. A storm out here's like a puddle back home." He gave me a half smile, but I could tell he wasn't convinced, and for some reason his unease stuck with me. The next day started out perfectly normal. Ethan and I spent the morning lounging by the pool, sipping on frozen cocktails while a live band played nearby. The weather was flawless, blue skies and a gentle breeze. But by the afternoon, things started to change. Dark clouds began to gather on the horizon. The air grew thick and humid, and the wind picked up, whipping through the open decks and rattling loose items. An announcement came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're expecting some rough weather ahead. Nothing to worry about, but we recommend staying indoors this evening for your safety." Passengers exchanged nervous glances, but the crew remained calm, assuring everyone it was just a precaution. Still, as I looked out at the darkening sky, I felt a chill run down my spine. The storm didn't look normal. It looked alive. Ethan nudged me. "I told you something was off." I laughed it off again, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. That night, the real nightmare began. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of thunder so loud it felt like it was inside my head. The ship was rocking violently, the sound of crashing waves echoing through the walls. I stumbled out of bed and nearly fell as the ship tilted sharply to one side. "Ethan!" I yelled, grabbing onto the wall for support. He burst into my cabin seconds later, his face pale. "We've got to get to higher ground. This storm is insane." We made our way toward the atrium, the heart of the ship. Along the way, we passed passengers clutching onto railings and crying out in fear as the ship groaned under the strain of the waves. Plates, glasses, and furniture crashed to the floor. The once pristine halls were now chaotic and littered with debris. Then, the power went out. The ship was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, the only sound was the storm raging outside. Emergency lights flickered to life, casting eerie red glows throughout the corridors. Shadows danced on the walls, and every creak and groan of the ship sounded like a scream. "Do you hear that?" Ethan whispered. "What?" "That growling." I stopped and listened. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere deep within the ship. My stomach dropped. We pressed on, trying to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. The growling sound grew louder, seeming to echo through the walls. "Maybe it's just the engines," I said, though I didn't believe it. We reached the atrium, and that's when we saw it. The massive chandelier that had hung proudly in the center of the room was now shattered on the floor, its shards scattered like tiny daggers. But that wasn't the worst part. Standing at the far end of the room was something. It looked human, but its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was featureless, save for two glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce straight through us. Ethan grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." We backed away slowly, but the figure started to move, its long, twisted limbs dragging across the floor. It let out another growl, a sound so deep and primal it made my chest ache. We ran. Somehow we made it back to one of the lower decks, where we found an abandoned storage room to hide in. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "What the hell was that?" I gasped. "I don't know," Ethan replied, "but it wasn't human." While catching our breath, Ethan noticed an old leather journal sitting on a shelf. He picked it up and flipped through its pages. The handwriting was shaky, the words frantic. It belonged to a crew member from decades ago. "They knew," Ethan whispered. "They knew this ship was cursed." The journal described a string of disappearances and strange events that always coincided with storms. It mentioned a creature that fed on fear and chaos, and then it described a way to stop it, a lantern hidden in the engine room that could banish the entity. "We have to find it," I said. "It's our only chance." Getting to the engine room was like navigating a labyrinth. The ship had become unrecognizable, its once familiar corridors twisting into a nightmarish maze. Doors that should have led to stairwells now opened into empty voids. The growling followed us, growing louder and more menacing. At one point, I swore I felt something brush against my shoulder, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Finally, we found the engine room. It was massive, filled with towering machinery and pipes that hissed with steam. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it sat the lantern. It was beautiful, made of brass and etched with intricate patterns. But the moment we touched it, the growling turned into a deafening roar. The creature appeared again, this time larger and more monstrous than before. Its body seemed to shift and writhe, like it was made of smoke and shadows. "Turn it on!" Ethan shouted. I fumbled with the lantern, my hands shaking, until I found the switch. A brilliant light burst forth, flooding the room. The creature let out an ear-piercing scream and began to dissolve, its body disintegrating into wisps of darkness. As the light grew brighter, the ship seemed to stabilize. The growling stopped. The storm outside began to calm, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. Ethan and I made our way back to the upper deck, where the remaining passengers and crew were starting to emerge. The captain approached us, his face pale and his eyes filled with regret. "You found it," he said, nodding toward the lantern. "Thank God." "You knew this would happen," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You knew this ship was cursed, and you still let us board." The captain looked down. "I thought the curse was over. I was wrong." When we finally docked in Miami, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief as I stepped onto solid ground. But as I looked back at the Ocean Monarch, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the growling. Thanksgiving last year was supposed to be a dream, a break from the usual chaos of family dinners and a chance to try something new. My parents, being the overachievers they are, decided that we'd all spend the holiday on a cruise. And by all, I mean the entire family. Me, 15 years old, my sister Rachel, 17, my brother Max, 13, our parents, my dad's brother and his wife, my mom's sister and her husband, and our cousins, Jack, 16, Emma, 14, and Tyler, 12. The ship was a floating city with glitzy lights, endless buffets, and enough activities to keep us occupied for days. We boarded in Long Beach, California, bound for Cabo San Lucas with a few stops along the way. It was supposed to be a week of fun and relaxation. When we got on board, my parents did what they always do on trips. They rented 2 suites. One was for them and the other adults, and the other was for us kids. "So we can have some peace," Mom joked, but we all knew the real reason. Wine and quiet dinners for them. Chaos and freedom for us. As we explored the ship, I couldn't help but notice a man standing near the boarding ramp. He was tall and lanky, wearing a long, tattered coat and holding a beat-up leather bag. His face was hard to make out under the brim of his hat, but something about him made me uneasy. He wasn't smiling like everyone else. He just stood there watching. "Creepy," Rachel muttered when she caught me staring. I laughed it off, but the image of him stuck with me. By the second night, we'd all settled into a routine. The adults were busy with their wine tastings and fancy dinners, leaving us kids to roam the ship. That night, Max, Emma, and Tyler wanted to check out the arcade. Rachel and Jack, of course, decided that I was the perfect chaperone. The walk to the arcade took us through one of the open decks. It was late, and the ship was eerily quiet. The sounds of the ocean and the cool breeze made it feel like we were the only ones awake. That's when I saw him again. The man from the boarding ramp was sitting in a lounge chair near the railing, staring at the floor. His coat looked even more worn under the dim deck lights, and his hat was pulled low over his face. "Don't look at him," I whispered, keeping my voice steady. We walked past him, my eyes darting to the shadows around us. Just as I thought we were in the clear, his raspy voice broke the silence. "Where are you kids off to?" We stopped, frozen in place. He was standing now, impossibly tall, his coat billowing slightly in the breeze. "To the arcade," I stammered. He didn't say anything, just reached into his coat. My heart stopped as he pulled out a small rusted knife and held it out toward us, his long arm stretching unnaturally far. "Need protection?" he asked, his voice flat and cold. "No, thank you," I said quickly, pulling Max and the others closer. He stared at us for what felt like forever before slipping the knife back into his coat and turning away. "What the hell was that?" Emma whispered. "I don't know," I replied. "Let's just get to the arcade." The arcade was mostly empty, just the hum of machines and flashing lights. Max, Emma, and Tyler dove into the games like nothing had happened, but I couldn't relax. Every sound made me jump, every shadow felt too long. I sat near the entrance trying to distract myself with my phone, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the man. Why was he here? How did he even get on board? About 10 minutes later, the arcade doors slid open with a soft hiss. I turned instinctively and felt my stomach drop. It was him. The man stepped inside, his hat still low over his face. He didn't look at anyone else, just me. "Guys," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, We need to go. Now. Why? We just got here, Max complained. Now, I snapped, grabbing his arm. I herded them out of the arcade, keeping an eye on the man the whole time. He didn't follow us immediately, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching. Back in the cabin, the younger kids shrugged off the whole thing and went straight to the TV. Rachel and I stayed up, scrolling through our phones and half watching some movie. It was past midnight when I noticed the remote was missing. Rachel, did you take it? No, she said, barely looking up. I started searching the couch, pulling up cushions and feeling around. That's when I heard a faint rustling noise. Did you hear that? I asked. Hear what? Rachel replied, but her voice was tense. The rustling came again, louder this time. My heart raced as I leaned closer to the couch. Stop messing around, I said, more to myself than her. And then, out of nowhere, a hand shot out from under the couch. Rachel screamed, and I stumbled back as the man crawled out, his knife glinting in the dim light. He stood slowly, towering over us, his face twisted into a sick grin. Quiet now, he whispered. Rachel grabbed a lamp from the table and swung it at him, smashing it against his arm. He yelped, but it didn't stop him. He lunged toward me, the knife slashing through the air. Instinct took over. I grabbed a chair and rammed it into him, knocking him back. Rachel was screaming for help, and I yelled at Max and the others to lock themselves in the bedroom. The man recovered quickly, his movements wild and erratic. He came at me again, but Rachel and I managed to dodge his swings. Just as I thought we were out of options, the door burst open. Jack and my dad rushed in, followed by ship security. The man turned to run, but they tackled him before he could get far. It took 3 guards to restrain him. He thrashed and growled like a caged animal, but eventually, they hauled him out of the room. The next morning, the captain called our family to his office. He looked shaken, his usual calm demeanor replaced with concern. We've reviewed the security footage, he began. That man, he's not a passenger. According to the footage, the man had snuck onto the ship during boarding, blending in with the crowd. He had been hiding in various parts of the ship for days, stealing food and avoiding detection. He entered your cabin while you were at the arcade, the captain said. He was under the couch for over an hour. My stomach churned. The thought of him watching us, waiting, made my skin crawl. The captain continued, explaining that the man had a history of mental illness and had escaped from a facility in San Diego weeks earlier. He had been reported as dangerous but not outright violent until now. The ship made an emergency stop in Los Angeles to hand him over to the authorities. Watching him being led off the ship in handcuffs should have been comforting, but all I felt was numb. Back home, things didn't feel normal for a long time. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, the way he moved, the look in his eyes. Every noise at night made me jump. We tried to move on, but the memories lingered. My parents got a full refund from the cruise line, but it didn't feel like enough. They promised we'd never go on another cruise again, and honestly, I was fine with that. Months later, I had a nightmare about the man. In it, he wasn't under the couch. He was standing at the foot of my bed, holding the knife out to me. When I woke up, I swore I could still hear his voice. Need protection? I'll never forget what the security guard said before we left the ship. You're lucky. Most people don't walk away from encounters like that. He was right, we were lucky, but sometimes luck doesn't feel like enough. When I graduated college, I thought it called for a celebration, a big one. So me and a group of friends decided to blow some cash on a luxury cruise around the Gulf of Mexico. No itinerary, no worries, just us, the ocean, and a ton of bad decisions. To be fair, we were all a bunch of overconfident, privileged idiots who thought the world owed us a party. And for the first day, that's exactly what it felt like. We boarded the ship in Miami, a sleek multi-deck behemoth with all the bells and whistles, pools, a casino, and a bar that seemed to pour drinks non-stop. The first night was a blur of laughter, drinking games, and way too many shots. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just the kind of chaos you'd expect from a bunch of 20-somethings with no sense of moderation. It wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. Passengers were talking in hushed tones about hearing strange noises in their cabins at night. One woman at breakfast swore she saw someone, or something, watching her from her balcony. I brushed it off as people being overly imaginative. After all, this was a cruise ship, not some haunted mansion. That night we hit the bar again. Drinks were flowing, music was blasting, and I, as usual, went a little too hard. I have a bad habit of not knowing when to stop, and this time was no different. By the time we decided to call it a night, I was so hammered I could barely walk. My friends practically had to drag me back to our shared cabin, laughing as they dumped me on the bed. "You'll thank us in the morning," Brian joked before they left, shutting the door behind them. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my head pounding like a drum. The room swayed slightly with the motion of the ship, making my nausea even worse. I groaned, cursing myself for overdoing it yet again. That's when I first heard it, a low guttural sound coming from somewhere in the room. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe the alcohol was messing with my head, or it was the ship creaking as it cut through the water. But the sound didn't stop. It was rhythmic like a growl mixed with heavy breathing, and it was definitely coming from inside the room. I froze, holding my breath to listen. My heart started pounding in my chest, each beat louder than the last. Slowly, I sat up and looked around, squinting into the dark. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the corner near the bathroom door. It was tall. I mean really tall. Its head was bent at an unnatural angle, as if it was too big to fit under the ceiling. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in long skeletal fingers. I couldn't make out its face, but its eyes. Oh God, its eyes. They were huge, glowing faintly red, like burning embers staring straight into my soul. I screamed, louder than I ever thought I could, and scrambled backward, falling off the bed and hitting the floor with a thud. My head spun as I fumbled for the lamp on the bedside table, my fingers shaking so badly I almost knocked it over. Finally, I managed to switch it on, flooding the room with light, and just like that, it was gone. The corner where it had been standing was empty. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might explode. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself it was just a hallucination, a trick of the light, or maybe the booze. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the image of those eyes. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like it was still there watching me, waiting. The next morning, I felt like a complete wreck. My head was still pounding, and my body felt like I'd been hit by a truck. I chalked it up to the hangover. But the memory of what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, wouldn't leave me alone. I didn't tell my friends what happened. I didn't want to be the punchline of their jokes for the rest of the trip. So I shoved it to the back of my mind and tried to focus on enjoying the day. We spent the afternoon lounging by the pool, sipping cocktails and soaking up the sun. For a while, I actually felt normal again, but as the day wore on and the sun dipped below the horizon, that unease started creeping back in. That night I avoided the bar. I told my friends I wasn't feeling great and went back to the cabin early. I figured if I just got some sleep, everything would be fine. But as soon as I walked into the room, I felt it, a heavy, suffocating presence, like the air had been sucked out and replaced with something wrong. I tried to ignore it. I turned on the TV for background noise and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin like a kid afraid of the dark. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. And then I heard it again. That same low, guttural sound, like something was growling deep in its chest. My whole body went stiff, and I turned my head toward the corner. It was back. The figure was taller this time, its head now brushing against the ceiling. Its long, thin arms hung limply by its sides, but its fingers twitched like they were itching to move. The eyes were brighter now, glowing like twin coals in the dark. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was looking directly at me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I just sat there paralyzed as the figure started to shift. Its body stretched and twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its shoulders widened and its head seemed to grow larger, pressing harder against the ceiling. The growling turned into something like a whisper, though I couldn't understand the words. I finally snapped out of it and bolted for the light switch. As soon as the lamp clicked on, the room was empty again. My heart was hammering in my chest as I stood there, gasping for air. I wasn't going to spend another second alone in that room. I grabbed my phone and ran out to the deck where the cool night air hit me like a slap in the face. I dialed my friend Brian, who answered on the third ring, his voice groggy and annoyed. "Dude, it's almost midnight. What do you want?" he said. "I need you to come to my room," I blurted out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Please, I don't want to be alone." "What's going on? You sound like you've seen a ghost," he joked. "I'm not kidding, Brian," I snapped. "Something's in my room. I don't know what it is, but it's not normal." There was a pause, and then he sighed. All right. Give me 5 minutes." When he showed up, I practically yanked him into the room and shut the door behind us. I told him everything, about the noises, the figure, the eyes. At first, he just laughed and said I was imagining things, probably from drinking too much. But when he saw how serious I was, his expression changed. "Okay, fine. I'll stay here tonight," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed with his laptop. "But you owe me for this." I nodded and climbed back into bed, leaving the lamp on. With Brian there, I felt a little safer. Maybe it was all in my head, I thought. Maybe I just needed someone else around to keep me grounded. But as the night wore on, the noises started again. Brian froze, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. We both turned toward the corner at the same time. The figure was back. It was taller than ever, its head now pressed flat against the ceiling, and its eyes burned brighter than before. This time its arms were moving, those long, skeletal fingers reaching out toward us. Brian let out a string of curses, and I dove for the light switch. The room went silent as the light came on. The corner was empty. Brian looked at me, his face pale. "Okay," he said, his voice shaking. "What the hell was that?" The next morning, Brian and I sat in the ship's cafeteria, nursing cups of coffee like they were our lifelines. Neither of us had slept after what happened. I could tell Brian was trying to process everything, but he didn't seem ready to talk about it yet. Finally, he broke the silence. "That thing," he said, staring into his cup. "I don't know what it was, but it wasn't normal." "No kidding," I muttered, my hands shaking as I brought the coffee to my lips. "I told you, Brian, this wasn't just in my head." We decided to investigate. If we were going to spend the rest of this cruise trapped on this ship, we needed answers. First, we started asking other passengers if they'd seen or heard anything unusual. Most just looked at us like we were crazy, but a few hesitated before shaking their heads, like they were hiding something. Then we found her, a middle-aged woman sitting alone on the sun deck, chain-smoking like her life depended on it. When we asked her about strange things happening on the ship, she looked at us with wide, haunted eyes. "You saw it, didn't you?" she whispered. Our stomachs dropped. "Saw what?" Brian asked. "The thing in the shadows," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the ocean. "It's been here for years. I've been on this cruise before, and every time someone sees it, sometimes it's just noises, shadows in the corner of your eye. Other times, it's worse." "What do you mean worse?" I pressed. She hesitated, looking around as if she were afraid the thing might overhear her. "A few years back, a man went missing on this ship. His friends said he'd been acting strange, paranoid, like something was following him. They found his belongings, but not him. The crew said he must have fallen overboard, but I don't think that's what happened." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I thanked her, but her story only made me more anxious. If this thing had been haunting the ship for years, what did it want? And why was it targeting me? That night, Brian insisted on staying in the room with me again. Neither of us wanted to risk being alone. We kept the light on, and I even propped a chair against the door as if that would somehow keep us safe. It didn't. The noises started up again, soft at first, like distant whispers, but they grew louder and more guttural as the night went on. Brian sat on the edge of his bed, his laptop forgotten, as we both stared at the corner. This time, the figure didn't wait for us to turn off the light. It started to materialize right in front of us, the shadows in the corner twisting and stretching until they formed its impossibly tall frame. Its glowing eyes locked onto me, and for the first time, it spoke. "You shouldn't be here," it rasped, its voice like nails scraping against metal. I couldn't move. My whole body felt frozen, like the thing's gaze had pinned me in place. Brian was yelling something, but it sounded distant, like he was underwater. The figure took a step closer, its long fingers twitching as if it were reaching for me. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The room was silent again, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Brian grabbed my arm, shaking me back to reality. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. "Now." We ran to the front desk, desperate for answers. The staff tried to brush us off, saying we must have been dreaming or imagining things. But one of the older crew members overheard us and pulled us aside. "You're not the first to see it," he said, his voice low. "And you won't be the last. This ship, it's cursed." He wouldn't say more, but his words confirmed what we'd feared. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to leave us alone. That night I knew I wouldn't make it through another encounter. The thing wasn't just haunting me, it was hunting me. Brian refused to leave my side, though his face was pale and his hands trembled every time we heard the slightest sound. We spent hours in the cabin, lights blazing, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, the room grew cold. Not just cold, freezing. Our breath came out in visible puffs, and the walls seemed to shimmer with frost. The lights flickered, and then, one by one, they went out, plunging us into darkness. I grabbed Brian's arm, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "It's here," I whispered, though I didn't need to say it. He already knew. The growl started again, low and guttural, coming from all around us. My eyes darted to the corner, but it was empty. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, it wasn't going to show itself. And then I saw it. The figure wasn't in the corner this time. It was standing at the foot of my bed, its head nearly scraping the ceiling. Its eyes blazed like twin infernos, and its long, spindly fingers twitched as it leaned toward me. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice reverberating through the room like an earthquake. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. It felt like invisible hands were holding me down, forcing me to meet its gaze. Behind me, Brian was shouting, but his words were drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat. The figure raised one of its hands, its skeletal fingers curling as it pointed at me. The growl deepened, morphing into a sound so inhuman it made my skin crawl. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I was going to pass out. And then Brian did something I'll never forget. He lunged forward, grabbing the lamp off the bedside table and smashed it on the floor. The room exploded with light as sparks flew from the broken bulb. The figure recoiled, letting out an ear-piercing screech as it dissolved into the shadows. The lights flickered back on, and the room was empty again. The suffocating cold lifted, and I could finally breathe. I looked at Brian, who was clutching the remains of the lamp with shaking hands. Did that actually work?" he stammered. I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know what had just happened. But I knew one thing. We had to get off that ship. The next morning, we docked in Cozumel, and Brian and I made the decision to leave the cruise early. We didn't care about the cost or the embarrassment of telling our friends. We just needed to get as far away from that ship as possible. To this day, I don't know what that thing was. A ghost? A demon? Something worse? I've read about hauntings and curses, but nothing comes close to what I experienced on that ship. The memory of those burning eyes still haunts me, and sometimes late at night I swear I can hear that low, guttural growl in the back of my mind. One thing's for sure. I'm never setting foot on a cruise ship again. It was early 2017, and my wife and I were celebrating our 5th wedding anniversary. I wanted to do something big this time, something unforgettable, My wife had always dreamed of going on a cruise. Something about the open sea, endless buffets and fancy dinners under the stars. So I made it happen. I booked us a week-long cruise that would take us from Miami through the Caribbean. The first couple of days were like stepping into another world. The ship was massive, like a floating city, with so much to do that we couldn't even decide what to try first. We went to live shows, hit the pools, indulged in way too much food, and soaked up the sun on the deck. I couldn't have asked for a better way to celebrate. By the third night, we were running on fumes after spending the whole day exploring. We'd spent the evening at this beautiful lounge with panoramic windows that made you feel like you were flying above the ocean. It was late, and when we finally got back to our cabin, all I could think about was collapsing into bed. But as soon as I sat down, my stomach dropped. I realized I didn't have my phone. I checked every pocket, searched through our bags, even under the bed. Nothing. That's when it hit me. I must have left it at the lounge. I told my wife, who immediately offered to come with me, but I could see how tired she was. She could barely keep her eyes open. "I'll be fine," I told her. "It's just a quick trip. I'll be back before you know it." The ship's common areas were still buzzing with life, even though it was well past midnight. I walked quickly back to the lounge, weaving through groups of people who seemed like they had no plans of going to bed anytime soon. When I got there, the bartender remembered me. "Yeah, I found a phone earlier," he said, reaching under the counter to hand it to me. I was relieved. "You're a lifesaver," I told him, pocketing it. On my way back, I started noticing how quiet the hallways had gotten. The energy of the ship felt completely different now. The long corridors, which had seemed exciting and full of life during the day, felt endless and kind of eerie at night. I thought I remembered the way to our cabin, but after a few minutes I realized I'd taken a wrong turn. No big deal. I'd just backtrack. But every corner I turned looked the same. Identical doors, identical walls. It was like the ship was messing with me. Then I remembered there was a big red abstract painting near our cabin. It was hard to miss, and I figured if I could just find that, I'd be home free. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't find it. I started getting frustrated, then anxious. I felt like I was walking in circles. Eventually, I came across a pair of heavy double doors. They weren't marked, but I figured they might lead to another section of cabins. I pushed them open, expecting to see more hallways. Instead, I was met with a steel staircase leading downward. It was dimly lit, and I could hear the low hum of machinery coming from below. At first, I thought it might be a shortcut. Maybe there was someone down there who could help me. Against my better judgment, I started descending the stairs one slow step at a time. The staircase seemed to go on forever, each step echoing louder than the last. The hum of machinery grew louder, blending with the occasional clank of metal. It didn't feel like a shortcut anymore, but I was already too far down to turn back. I told myself I'd just look around, maybe find someone from the crew, and head back up. At the bottom, I stepped into a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with exposed pipes, and the floor was slick like it had just been mopped. Or worse, like it was always damp. The air was heavier here, carrying a mix of oil, metal, and something faintly rotten. My gut told me I didn't belong here, but my curiosity kept me moving forward. Then I saw it. At the far end of the corridor, where the light barely reached, there was a figure standing with their back to me. They were motionless, their shoulders stiff, almost like they were listening for something. My first thought was relief. Finally, someone who could help me find my way back. "Hello?" I called out. No response. "Hey, I think I'm lost. Can you help me out?" I said, a little louder this time. Still nothing. I took a cautious step closer, and that's when they moved. Slowly, they turned to face me, their movements unnervingly deliberate. The dim light didn't do much to reveal their face, but what I could see was enough to send a chill down my spine. Their eyes were wide, too wide, and their expression was blank, but somehow wrong. For a moment, we just stared at each other. My heart was racing, and I had no idea what to do. Then without warning, they started running, full speed, straight at me. I froze. I don't know if it was fear or disbelief, but my legs wouldn't move. The sound of their footsteps pounding against the floor snapped me out of it, and I turned to run. My shoes slipped on the slick floor, but adrenaline kicked in and I sprinted back to the stairs. As I climbed, I could hear them behind me, closer and closer, their footsteps heavy, their breathing uneven. Then I heard something else. Laughter. Not the kind of laugh you hear at a party, but something sharp and chaotic, like it didn't belong to a human being. I reached the top of the stairs, slammed through the double doors, and kept running. I didn't dare look back until I turned a corner. When I did, I saw the figure standing behind the doors, their face pressed against the glass. They were smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that made my stomach churn. They didn't move, they just stood there, watching as I stumbled further away. I didn't stop running until I reached the main entertainment area. The lights, the noise, the people. It all felt surreal, like I'd stepped into another world. I leaned against a wall, trying to catch my breath, and looked around to make sure I wasn't followed. No one seemed to notice anything out of the ordinary. I stayed in the crowded entertainment area for a while, pretending to scroll through my phone, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold it. Every time someone walked past me, I'd flinch, half expecting to see that twisted smile again. I wanted to tell someone, but who would believe me? "Excuse me, there's a creepy guy stalking me in the bowels of the ship." It sounded ridiculous, even in my head. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a prank. The ship was full of people. Someone had to be messing with me, right? After a deep breath, I retraced my steps back to the lounge. From there, I found the red abstract painting near my cabin. Relief washed over me as I finally slid the keycard into the door. Inside, my wife was still sound asleep, her breathing slow and steady. I didn't want to wake her, so I quietly locked the door, double-checked it, and leaned against it for a moment. My heart was still pounding, but at least I felt safe. I climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to shake the image of that grin from my mind. It took a long time, but eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, I told my wife about what had happened. At first, she thought I was joking. "Are you sure it wasn't just some drunk guy?" she asked. I wanted to believe that, but the memory of those eyes and that laugh, it didn't fit. We agreed to report it to the ship's staff just in case. When we spoke to the crew, they were polite but didn't seem to take us seriously. They checked the security footage from the corridor, but there was nothing. No figure, no movement, just me walking alone. It didn't make sense. How could they not see what I saw? They told us they'd look into it, but I could tell they thought I was imagining things. The rest of the cruise went smoothly, but I couldn't relax. Every time I passed a reflective surface, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that face again. I barely slept, and even during the day, the hallways felt darker, quieter. On the last night of the cruise, while we were packing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the wood of our cabin door were 3 words: "You came back." I froze, staring at the message, my mind racing. I showed it to my wife, but before I could say anything, she laughed nervously. "It's probably just some bored kid," she said. But I knew better. That wasn't random. It was a warning. We disembarked the next morning, leaving the ship and its haunted corridors behind. But even now, years later, I can still hear that laugh in my nightmares. I'll never forget the way those eyes locked onto mine, or the way that smile stretched just a little too wide. I don't know who or what I saw down there, but one thing is certain. I'm never stepping foot on a cruise ship again. It all started with Claire's text. "Hey, I've got 2 tickets to the Harmony of the Seas. Want to join? First-class cabins. My treat." I almost didn't reply. My job as a journalist didn't leave much time for leisure, but Claire wasn't someone you said no to. She was magnetic, bright, funny, and always full of energy. We'd been friends since college, and she had this way of pulling me out of my comfort zone. "Fine, you win. When do we leave?" When we arrived at the dock in Miami, the ship was larger than life. It towered over us, a floating city with endless balconies, pools, and glistening windows. Claire practically skipped up the boarding ramp while I dragged my suitcase, already questioning my decision. As we checked into our suite, Claire flopped onto her bed, staring up at the ceiling. "Okay," she said. "Am I crazy, or does this place feel weird?" I laughed, tossing my bag onto the chair. "Weird? Claire, this is luxury. What could possibly be weird about it?" "I don't know," she said, sitting up and fidgeting with her bracelet. I felt it the moment we got on board, like someone's watching me. I dismissed it as travel nerves, but during dinner, her unease spread to me. Across the dining room, a man sat alone. He was dressed in a crisp suit, but something about him didn't fit. He didn't eat or drink. He just sat there, staring at us, or more specifically, at Claire. "Do you see him?" she whispered. "Yeah, maybe he's just shy." "No," Claire said, gripping her fork. "He's been staring since we sat down." I waved it off, but truthfully, the guy gave me chills too. After dinner, we walked around the ship, trying to shake off the unsettling vibe. Claire suggested we check out the top deck to breathe in the ocean air. It was nearly midnight, and the deck was empty except for the sound of waves crashing below. Claire leaned against the railing, her blonde hair catching the moonlight. "You feel better now?" I asked. "Yeah," she said softly. "Sorry for freaking out earlier." But as she spoke, I noticed a figure in the shadows. "Claire," I said, trying to stay calm. "Don't turn around, someone's watching us." "What?" Her voice was barely a whisper. I nodded toward the far end of the deck. It was the man from dinner, leaning casually against a pillar. "Let's go," Claire said, grabbing my arm. We walked quickly toward the stairs, but when I glanced back, he was following us. Back in our cabin, Claire locked the door and slid a chair under the handle. "I don't feel safe here," she said, her voice trembling. I tried to reassure her, but deep down, I felt it too. Something was wrong with this ship. The next morning, Claire was gone. Her bed was untouched, her shoes still by the door. I checked the dining room, the pool, even the spa. Nothing. When I reported her missing to the crew, they reviewed the security footage. "There," I said, pointing at the screen. "That's us on the deck." The footage showed Claire returning to the top deck alone after we'd gone to bed. The man appeared behind her, but his face glitched like static. Claire turned to him and the screen went black. "She fell overboard," the head of security said, his tone detached. "These things happen." "Fell? Are you kidding me?" I shouted. "She was pushed. You saw the footage." He exchanged a glance with another officer and shrugged. "The footage is inconclusive. We'll keep investigating, but accidents like this are common." Furious, I stormed out. Claire hadn't just fallen. Someone, or something, had taken her. Later that day, I met Miguel, a janitor who seemed unusually nervous. "You're looking for your friend, right?" he asked quietly. "Yeah. Do you know something?" He hesitated. "You didn't hear this from me, but people disappear on this ship all the time. They say it's accidents, but it's not." "What do you mean?" Miguel glanced around before leaning closer. "There's something wrong with this place. Passengers, crew, they vanish. And that man you saw? He's been here for years. No one knows who he is." Before I could ask more, a voice barked from behind us. "Hey, get back to work." A manager glared at Miguel, who quickly walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. That night, I searched the ship's forums and archives, looking for any mention of missing passengers. What I found was chilling. Dozens of posts about disappearances on the Harmony of the Seas. Each case had the same details: nighttime vanishings, shadowy figures, and blank spots in security footage. Then I found a video posted by a former crew member. It showed a woman walking alone on the top deck, much like Claire. The same man appeared behind her and the screen glitched. I replayed the footage, my stomach churning. The knock at my door startled me. I opened it cautiously, but no one was there. Instead, A note lay on the floor. Meet me in the engine room. Midnight. Come alone. At midnight, I descended into the ship's belly. The engine room was loud and hot, the hum of machinery filling the air. Miguel was waiting for me. You shouldn't have come, he said, his face pale. They're watching you now. Who's watching me? The ship, he said. It's alive. It feeds on people, and that man, he's part of it. He lures them in. I wanted to call him crazy, but deep down, I felt he was right. Before he could say more, the lights flickered and the temperature dropped. A shadow moved in the corner, and Miguel froze. He's here, Miguel whispered. The shadow grew, forming into the man from the footage. His face was clearer now, his eyes glowing faintly. Miguel screamed as the man lunged at him, dragging him into the darkness. I ran, the sound of Miguel's screams echoing behind me. Back in my cabin, I barricaded the door and tried to call for help, but my phone wouldn't work. Suddenly, the screen lit up with a video. It was Claire standing by the railing. She looked right into the camera, her face blank. Behind her, the man appeared. I threw the phone down, my heart pounding. When the ship docked in Miami, I was the first one off. I reported everything to the authorities, but no one believed me. The cruise line denied everything, calling me delusional. Weeks later, I received a package in the mail. Inside was Claire's bracelet and a photo of her standing on the top deck, the man beside her. On the back of the photo were 2 words: "You're next."